Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 11.10. We'll be breaking down each tier of synergies and delving into what makes those traits useful in the current meta. The current meta is a bit lacking in diversity as most games are dominated by just a few traits, so there's definitely a gap between the S tier traits and the rest. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier, which consists of Dragonslayer, Skirmisher, Legionnaire, Ironclad, and Cavalier. These traits are currently at the top of the meta and define what compositions most players will run each game. At the top of the S tier, we have Dragonslayer. Dragonslayer as a trait is not all that impressive. What is impressive are the Dragonslayer champions. All of them have a place in the current meta, specifically Mordekaiser, as he's capable of both frontlining and carrying. Dragonslayer also overlaps heavily with Skirmishers and Legionnaire, with all these traits making up a bulk of the meta. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Trundle, as he's extremely effective at wrecking hard-to-kill frontline units. Next, we have Skirmishers, which are the main culprits of how fast the current pace of the game is. This is because most of the Skirmishers are low-cost champions, meaning you can hit 6 of the trait at level 6. And the power boost of having 6 Skirmishers usually saves the player a lot of health, while the rest of the lobby loses to them. Besides increasing the speed of the game, Skirmishers also do well in stage 4 and 5 with Jax as the carry. While Skirmishers aren't unbeatable, they are still one of the easiest, if not the easiest, compositions to run currently, and hitting Jax 2 with 6 Skirmishers is a consistent way to place in the top 4. Legionnaire is the third trait defining the current meta and arguably has a better late game presence than Skirmishers. This is because the combination of Mordekaiser and Draven is quite effective, with Mordekaiser being nigh unkillable in the front, with Draven dishing out a ton of damage from the back. At the end of the day, all 3 Dragonslayer, Skirmisher, and Legionnaire make up a bulk of the meta, so there's not too much of a power difference between them. Ironclad sneaks into the S tier for a few reasons. One is both Jax and Rel are top meta champions. 2 is that there's far more physical damage builds being played than there are magic damage, so increasing the armor of your board with Ironclad is quite useful. Speaking of Rel, our last trait for the S tier is Cavalier. Cavaliers have quite a few uses in the current meta, but Rel is by far the main reason as to why we have the trait rated so high. On her own, she's the best frontline champion, as she needs no items or even traits to do well thanks to her ability. But adding Cavalier does increase her survivability, and Cavalier is great for other builds like the brand Hecarim comp that has been gaining a lot of popularity. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Assassin, Knight, God King, Mystic, Eternal, Invoker, Dawnbringer, Abomination, and Spellweaver. While these synergies aren't quite as powerful as their previous tier, they are doing consistently well in the current meta. First, we have Assassin. This may come as a surprise seeing Assassin so high up on the tier list, but Assassin builds are rising in popularity. Katarina is still the main carry, but both LeBlanc and Nocturne are capable of carrying, which helps diversify Assassin builds. While Assassins aren't as strong late game, they do increase the effectiveness of Viego, which is one of the best late game champions currently. Knights are back as a solid frontline option now that Vayne is no longer playable. With less true damage to worry about, you can run a mixture of Knights and other traits as your frontline. In particular, we're seeing Knight plus Ironclad do well, especially to stall out fights long enough for champions like Kayle to carry. Let's be real, God King isn't a real trait. The 20% increased damage to only a few specific traits is not all that useful. And Darius, well, Darius is almost the same power level as a 3 cost. So why is God King rated so high? Because of Garen. Garen single-handedly makes magic damage compositions viable in the late game. Not only because he's a solid frontliner, but because he can AoE shred the magic resist of nearby champions when he uses his ability. Plus, being Dawnbringer, he can survive a long time between his shields and healing. So yes, God King isn't great, but Garen is. While physical damage is reigning supreme, there's plenty of magic damage which boosts the usefulness of Mystic. It continues to be a solid splash trait with really great champions, especially Ryze with his crowd control capabilities. Since we're talking about Mystic, that leads us to Kindred and Eternal. Despite the meta not favoring 5-cost champions right now, Kindred is still doing well as their utility can win games. And having Eternal means you get an extra unit, though Wolf isn't all that powerful. Still, extra damage and being able to heal Kindred so they can use their ultimate is useful. Invoker is still the best splash trait in the game for magic-focused compositions. It's a bit difficult to fit in because of the champions, but having it is going to help a lot in allowing your champions to use their abilities more often. And Karma is still capable of carrying, though doing so is much harder and less consistent than running builds like Skirmisher or Legionnaire. As we mentioned a few of the champions, let's now talk about Dawnbringer. Dawnbringer is amazing early game, with Gragas being one of the best frontline champions you can run through stage 2 and 3. The trait does fall off a bit late game, but does gain value when you're able to run Garen and Karma together. Just be wary of relying too much on the healing, as more and more players are running healing reduction. Abomination is back after receiving a few buffs in patch 11.10. Okay, it's not the best trait, but at least it has a place in the meta. The monstrosity is less effective later on in the game, but it has enough of a presence during stage 2 and 3 to warrant a place in the A tier. Alongside Abomination is Spellweaver. The trait isn't all that useful unless you can run 4 of them, which is where Abomination comes in, as the two traits pair well together. Late game, you may not see Spellweaver as much, though Vel'Koz is still playable as a carry. That said, the mid game of 4 Spellweaver, 3 Abomination is quite strong and certainly viable in the current meta. Let's now move on to the B tier. This tier consists of Forgotten, Hellion, Brawler, Nightbringer, Coven, Redeemed, Caretaker, and Revenant. These are traits that can do well under the right circumstances. Forgotten has been on a roller coaster, with being essential at the end of 11.9 because of Vayne, to falling off super hard in 11.10. But it's found its niche place in the meta, as 6 Forgotten with Draven is an alright mid to late game composition. Outside of that, you're unlikely to see Forgotten do well, though 3 Forgotten isn't that uncommon because a lot of the champions are doing well in the meta. Hellions are in an awkward position. They can still do really well in the early game if you can 2-star them quickly and have a strong mid-game presence. But there's plenty of other options in the meta that are just more consistent, plus Hellions don't scale well into the late game. This leaves it in a place where it's playable, but almost never necessary. Brawlers have returned to being one of the weaker front lines now that having high health isn't as valuable as damage reduction or armor. Still, they are useful early game and have some value when running either Draconic or Abomination. There's a big issue with Nightbringer, and the issue is Aphelios. Aphelios, well, he sucks, to put it bluntly. Yes, you can play him, but his ability to carry is nowhere as strong as other 4-cost carries. Because of that, Nightbringer is in an awkward place. Early game, the trait is still useful, and there is Yasuo as a carry. But Yasuo isn't consistent enough, so it's rare to see Nightbringer do well past the early stages of the game. Coven has a place in the meta entirely because of Katarina and LeBlanc with Assassins. If those champions weren't doing well, Coven would likely never be used. But the boost in ability power helps make Katarina a top mid-game carry, so we can't be too harsh on Coven. That said, you're unlikely to want the trait outside of Assassins, especially with Lysandra basically not being a unit anymore. Unfortunately for Redeemed, there are just better defensive traits in the current meta. The idea of Redeemed is to provide a boost of stats that trickle down as units die, making the last one standing really strong. But the only champion this benefits is Kayle, and quite frankly, there's far better stalling options to use when you're running Kayle. This leaves Redeemed in an awkward spot late game, as it really has no carry, though Vel'Koz is happy with the increased ability power. That said, Redeemed is useful early game, especially with a Varus carry. It's just going to fall off quite hard once you hit the mid and late game. We debated putting Caretaker lower on the tier list, but Heimerdinger, despite all the nerfs he's received, is still capable of doing well in the late game. But to do so, you need at least 1 mana item, preferably a Shojin, and Invoker. Even then, he's not guaranteed to win rounds, as there's a lot of inherent randomness to the targeting of his baby dragon. Oftentimes what ends up happening by the time Heimerdinger casts his ability, most of your board is already dead. Shojin, attack speed, Invoker, and even Renewer can help, but with a mana pool of 140, it's going to be tough for Heimerdinger to carry a fight. And lastly, for the B tier, we have Revenant. This trait got hit hard with nerfs to the point where it's almost not even a trait when running 2 Revenant. The reason it's not at the bottom of the tier list is that, despite being nerfed, both Ivern and Volibear are still useful. Ivern still has use as an Invoker and can safely cast his ability most fights. Volibear is inconsistent, but he can remove shields, which is strong against Skirmishers and Mordekaiser. Alright, let's move to the last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Draconic, Ranger, Renewer, Cruel, and Verdant. These traits have far less use in the current meta, either due to a lack of usable champions or being difficult to use consistently. At the top of the C tier, we have Draconic. Draconic is an odd trait, much like traits from previous sets with similar design spaces like Space, Pirates, and Fortune. At times, Draconic is really strong. Specifically, if you're able to find Draconic on 2-1 and run them as early as possible, you can set yourself up for a strong mid-game. On the other hand, if you find Draconic too late, basically after stage 2, the trait practically does nothing. The champions just aren't strong enough, especially with the meta shifting towards stronger front lines that neither Set nor Ashe can kill fast enough. Still, the trait isn't completely useless if you find it early enough, but outside of stage 2, we recommend not using the synergy. Ranger is struggling right now because there's no reliable carry. Aphelios got nerfed hard, and while he can still be used as a carry, the fact is, he's nowhere near up to par with the other 4-cost carries. Varus is honestly a better carry than Aphelios, though he falls off once you hit the mid-game, and neither Vayne nor Ashe can carry well. Thus, Ranger is left in an awkward state of not having a solid place in the meta. Renewer was doing well last meta after the Lissandra build became popular. Unfortunately, Lissandra was nerfed heavily to the point she's almost unplayable even as an early 2-star unit. With Lissandra and Heimerdinger nerfed, there's no real reason to run Renewer except by happenstance late game if you're using Ivern for Invoker and have Heimer on your board. The trait isn't inherently bad, there's just no champions worth using it for in the current meta. With the pace of the game having sped up because of traits like Skirmisher, the cruel trait for Teemo is far too punishing for most players to make use of. Sacrificing 6 health late game for 1 Teemo is too steep of a price that the majority of the players in the lobby won't be able to afford. And having a 1-star Teemo isn't that much of a power spike to warrant losing health. Sure, Teemo 2 is strong, but again, you're losing a lot of health for him. The current meta and pace of the game just doesn't favor Teemo at all. And lastly, we have Verdant, which did receive a buff in patch 11.10. But let's be real, it's still not a trait. It has some use in the Kayle Knight composition, but you're never going to see 3 Verdant used, so having 5 seconds of CC immunity won't be all that useful. Especially since it doesn't stop utility items like Zephyr. Until they either make Verdant last a ridiculously long time or add more functionality, it's likely we won't ever see this trait do well. That's all we have for today's tier list video. The meta definitely favors only a few of the top traits. That said, we still see plenty of playable compositions, but until the next patch, the meta is likely to remain in a somewhat stale state unless new builds pop up like we saw in the latter half of patch 11.9. Let us know in the comment section below what you think of the current meta and what changes you'd like to see in the next patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.